Do Florida schools need to rethink how they teach Black history? Florida goes further than a lot of states when it comes to Black history education, but some experts say it's still not enough.
If you could give Florida schools a letter grade on how they teach Black history, what would you give them?
It'd definitely be a D or an F.
And that's coming from someone who helped shape Florida's Black history curriculum for more than 20 years. Let's take a deeper dive into why Black history matters for our future, what Florida schools are doing right, and what they can do better. Let's see what's brewing. Hi, I'm Jenna Bourne, and I'm an investigative reporter at 10 Tampa Bay. If you're new here, welcome to our caffeine-fueled, homemade deep dive into issues that matter to you. So if you're like me, what you remember from your Black history education probably goes something like slavery, Harriet Tubman, there's a civil war, slavery ends, desegregation, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr. I definitely got the impression that racism was history, a thing of the past. Obviously, it's not, and obviously there's a lot more to Black history than slavery and the I have a dream speech.
African Americans, students are suffering. They can't be what they don't see. So if they see nothing but white males being prosperous and successful, then they are not going to see themselves like that.
I was blown away by the tremendous impact African Americans had on the current life of everyday Floridians, especially our system of free public education, which was inspired and created by an African American by the name of Jonathan Gibbs.
Don't remember learning about Jonathan Gibbs in school? Me neither. That's James Hargret. He's a former state senator and represented Tampa in the state legislature for a combined 18 years. And, oh, no big deal, he wrote Florida's Black history education law that passed in 1994.
Much of the history that I learned in school was whitewashed and sanitized and bore no relationship to the actual facts.
Why is it so important that we not whitewash history?
History teaches us lessons of the past so we don't make the same mistakes that were made in the past.
In other words, you can't understand systemic racism today, what these protests are about right now, if you don't understand how racism has been woven through American history. Okay, so we've established why learning about Black history matters. So let's get back to our question. Do Florida schools need to rethink how they teach Black history? Let's take a look at the law Senator Hargret got passed in 1994. It requires Florida students learn about the history of African Americans, including the history of African peoples before the political conflicts that led to the development of slavery, the passage to America, the enslavement experience, abolition, and the contributions of African Americans to society. And Florida has an oversight committee to help school districts comply with that law, the Commissioner of Education's African American History Task Force. It's made up of 12 Floridians, mostly people who work in school districts, at universities, and also a couple of lawmakers. Because of those two things alone, the state law and the task force, Florida stands out in a good way from most other states. According to the National Council for the Social Studies in 2017, Florida is one of 7 states to pass a law requiring Black history be taught in public schools and have a Black History Oversight Committee. And Florida has specific social studies standards, including Black history, from elementary through high school. But those standards aren't perfect. While they mention slavery more than 100 times, they've been missing a pretty big moment in Florida Black history this whole time. And it's horrifying. The 1920 Ocoee Election Day riots.
I grew up in Central Florida. I went to Central Florida Public Schools, and I had never heard of this.
Yeah, it's troubling. I didn't hear of it, and I grew up right next to Ocoee. It wasn't until I moved to the city of Ocoee that I heard about the massacre.
On Election Day in 1920, after a Black man tried to exercise his legal right to vote, a white mob lynched an unknown number of Black people living in Ocoee and destroyed their homes. According to the Orange County Regional History Center, it was the largest incident of voting day violence in U.S. history. 100 years later, the governor signed a bill last month State Senator Randolph Bracy pushed for, requiring the massacre be taught in Florida schools.
I think it charts a path on where we need to go and how we need to go forward. Florida has a dark history when it comes to racial violence against Black people. And I think it's important that our kids know that so that we never repeat our history.
While Florida law requires students to learn about Black history, they're not required to take any specific courses on Black history. Brandon Grigg says that's a mistake. He's the only teen on the state's African American History Task Force.
Just having an African American history class as a part of your curriculum can be really important for changing some of those views. And I think it definitely was for me, and it made me a lot prouder of being an African American, and it allowed me to learn about my history for the very first time.
Now here's where things get tricky. It's one thing to have a law requiring schools to teach Black history. It's another thing to enforce it. And Florida's law has no teeth.
I don't think that there's a problem with the information itself or the curriculum. The problem is there's no repercussions for not using it. We need to make some type of mandate. We need to ensure that they are teaching it, and that if they do not teach it, then there's some repercussions thereof.
Florida law gives each school district the final say on what instructional materials make it into the classroom. And on top of that, it's ultimately the teachers who decide how to present that material. It doesn't always go well.
You don't want kids to feel, embarrassed during the class, or for someone to teach it the wrong way, because that can also oftentimes happen when you have a teacher who's, disrespectful of African American culture and can make other African American kids feel uncomfortable.
But we got a sign last month that teachers are stepping up on their own. Every year, the African American History Task Force hosts a summer institute to provide school districts training and tools to improve their Black history instruction. The Summer Institute usually gets 25 to 40 participants. This year, the task force chair tells me more than 500 educators logged into their 3-day virtual institute, the largest turnout they've ever had. Now for a less exciting number. The task force has classified just 9 of Florida's 73 school districts as being exemplary in how they teach Black history. Here in Tampa Bay, Hillsborough, and Pinellas are on that list. This year, for the first time, 26 years after Florida passed its Black history education law, we're coming a step closer to accountability for these school districts. Districts now have to submit a report every year to the State Education Commissioner that describes how they taught required topics, including Black history. Those reports must include the specific courses in which instruction will be delivered for each grade level, and a description of the materials and resources utilized to deliver instruction. So do Florida schools need to rethink how they teach Black history? You heard Dr. Bernadette Kelly's opinion at the beginning of this episode. She'd give Florida schools a D or F. She's been principal investigator on the task force for 20 years.
Even though Florida has written into their state law that students must learn about Black history, even though Florida has an oversight committee for that, even though Florida now requires schools to send in documentation of how they're teaching Black history, you would still give Florida schools a D or an F on how they teach
That's
Black
right.
history.
This is the first year that there's been some type of requirement.
And I found, once again, non-compliance has no consequences. The Florida Department of Education tells me 68 of the state's 73 school districts met the July 1st deadline to submit their reports. I asked what happens to the school districts who missed that deadline. A department spokesperson told me, "We will work with any district missing the deadline to help them submit their required instruction reports." In other words, nothing. And that could mean continuing a cycle where students are left in the dark.
In order to move more toward a multicultural society, other cultures have to hear and understand the African American experience.
If there's a topic you think What's Brewing should look into, send us a tip at turnto10@wtsp.com. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss an episode, and I'll see you next time.
Mocha, are you going to help me edit this? There's a lot of work left to go here, so I'm going to need you to step up.